Oh, yes.
Combined arms, but all motorised. I've seen everywhere, everyone loves them. Wonderful little bit and pieces. One of the histories behind the Jeep. So this is almost like scout vehicles.
You stay sat down, don't you get up. You've worked hard. We've worked hard.
Oh, yeah, I'll watch this.
So.
5, 10.
So other things, the military, the weird thing is, of course, the military has to do everything that civilian contractors would normally do in civilian life. So we've got a road roller there. Again, if you think of things like Normandy, Royal Air Force, US Air Force had to quickly step up to create airfields, recreate road in bombed areas, etc. So you're going to have things like road rollers, dozers being able to flatten and lay out roads as well there. So you'll see sometimes the equipment was taken straight, sometimes they'd adapt it. So there's a whole series of bulldozers that they ended up putting armour plate on, some used literally on D-Day itself to clear beach obstacles. So again, this mix of wider military vehicle fraternity, you know, you can pretty much have anything that's painted green and it'll fit somewhere. Guns added, you can see on the top. Sometimes they put armoured windshields on them. There's an original one left in the, if you go to Brussels, there's a wonderful military museum there. They've got one literally as it was almost the day it was left. Looks quite fantastic. You can see on the top, sometimes they put armoured windshields on them. There's an original one left in the, if you go to Brussels, there's a wonderful military museum there. They've got one literally as it was almost the day it was left. Looks quite fantastic. Site.
during the time you're here. Obviously with the tank park, there's times we can't let people into that area because vehicles are going to be moving. Now, on with our little Second World War display. So what we've got here, just imagine late in the war, here we've got Allied forces advancing, and we've got two of the tanks that they used for reconnaissance late in the war. We've got something called the M24 Chaffee tank in advance, and the tank it was aimed to replace in World War II. And the Americans latched onto that, so we were the ones who said give them Civil War general names. So Chaffee was an American general, Stewart, Reb Stewart, Grant, Lee, you've heard those names before, American Civil War. So it was a way of helping to identify other than used by the British Army. We start by buying some, and then they come across with Lend-Lease out in the desert. Firepower was only a 37mm gun, which they realised relatively quickly wasn't powerful enough. So with this M24 Chaffee, when they're making Cadillac, who are asked to design a kind of upgraded reconnaissance tank, they put that gun on, and that's actually a pretty big gun. It's 75mm. It was originally designed to actually go version. You'll notice it's got quite a high engine deck, and that's because it's got a radial engine in the back. Big round radial aeroplane, R975 engine in the back there. That means it's higher, and that means that transmission is taking all the way from the middle of that engine all the way through to the front, and the actual gearbox is in the front. That's good because it gives a little bit of extra metal protection. The downside was very quickly they realised that 37mm gun wasn't doing much to the enemy, and to the point that some units took the turrets off their Stuart tanks and just used them, what they called shorn off, as racing around and using the open turret top as an observation area for reporting back. Because with reconnaissance, sometimes you can fight for the information, and so we made armoured vehicles like the Saladin after World War II with a Punchin 76 gun on it, or you can do it by stealth. And on the whole, if you've met the enemy, then you need to get out of the way. It's really for the tanks. Good turn of speed to them, about 35 miles an hour on the open road, so that gave you some sort of protection. They've also angled the armour, so there's more armour to go through by putting it at that angle. Not only will that deflect round, it means that you've actually got more to go through. And interestingly, one of the designers at Cadillac, Harley Earl, he went on afterwards to design with some of their Sherman variants. The Americans were very keen to try and keep the Sherman in production without getting distracted into lots of what was called an E2 version assault tank, and it got the nickname pretty much after the war, not during the war, the Jumbo. And what this was to answer was they thought in January of 1944, before the D-Day landings, they realised they might be going up against German fortifications, not on D-Day, but the West Wall. So they wanted a heavy armoured tank that would have more protection. And so this tank, they did some tests. They drove a normal Sherman around with about 30,000 pounds worth of extra weight on it to actually see if they could add more armour. Now, as I've been yapping, we can see the Germans have turned up on the battlefield, and we've got our Shermans there, one with a 76mm gun firing off. We've got 75mm gun Shermans as well, all in a bit of a barreled 88mm gun. They've got a gun and he's going to use it. Tiger, the Nashorn, the famous elephant tank as well. This is the gun that Hitler particularly wanted on his tanks because he saw the devastating firepower it had. But as I mentioned, the downside of that is they've only given their production 413 of these, 1,300 Tigers. You look at that compared to, you're looking at 39,000 Sherman tanks you've got there. So tank for tank, yes, they might not be a match, but of course in World War II scenarios, what we're seeing here is a pretty fair representation, in the sense there were a lot more Shermans to be able to take on those rarer German tanks when they were on the battlefield, if they could get them going. And again, the Battle of the Bulge, famous example there, where they have assembled what's left of their German armoured force, they put it together, but quite frankly, it runs out of petrol. It fails to capture petrol stock, it can't resupply itself because of Allied air power, and most of the German tanks in the Battle of the Bulge, because they have to be abandoned because they've run out of fuel, the diesel tanks. But if you can't supply them with fuel, with ammunition, they're not going to be any good at all. And one of the other things the Germans had towards the end of the war, they're getting more sophisticated tanks here well enough, they've not had enough training time, so they're the ones actually. So whatever your tank is, however good it is, it's only as good as the crew there that are keeping that vehicle going. Are Chaffee still driving around there? Chaffee went on into service. Well, the Americans again were quite clever about this. What they were looking at as well is you don't just build one type of vehicle, you build a whole family on the top. Once you've got a reliable engine, they're very good, this engine actually could be slid out the back of that tank on a couple of rails for a quick exchange of the engine. We may not have had the best tank of the war, but we had enough of them, and they were part of a wider system that at the time was, certainly compared to the Germans, was material rich. These are tanks, like coming on now, we've got a British, I think we're just seeing over the back there. If this is the Cromwell, we've got a Centaur here today. They look very similar tanks, like the Churchill, the Matilda II. The problem we had was our emphasis in Britain in World War II in 1940, we changed our emphasis. So we have about a 2-year hiatus before we get back to getting really in the game. The Americans fill that gap for German tank engines. The trouble was those engines were in demand for aircraft. Aircraft took priority. Only later, when we had enough Merlin engines for the aircraft industry, could we make the Meteor in quantity. That goes in this family of vehicles that we call the Cromwell, so it becomes the A27 proper Cromwell tank. What we're seeing driving around at the moment is an earlier version. It looks exactly the same as the Cromwell from outside, but it's got a Liberty, a First World War tank, 75mm US gun. They had 6-pounder guns in them as well, another one of those tank stories. This Grant tank from the Bannister collection. This is the tank that really gets the ball rolling for the Americans. They're about to build a tank called the M2 in 1940. They realised it wasn't going to be good enough. They're not in the war. Why don't you come in with our tank programme? And we end up buying the Grant and then the Sherman instead of having our own tanks made in America. As the Centaur goes past, you'll see it's got what they call crystal suspension. Springs inside the hull there make the ride. The Grant tanks, we use them in the Western Desert. Only one American unit used the Grant in anger in Tunisia. I'll firing off its pyros there for you. And then they basically move straight onto the M4. We pass our Grant tanks on to see service in Burma and the Far East. And we may see a bit later on, some were converted to actually become tug tanks, so recovery tanks. There's countries where they took them off and used them as tugs, or as they mounted cranes on the top of them. So they managed to get the hulls back, but they hadn't, by this time they'd lost all the turrets. Now some of the early tanks in the Cromwell series, we had very good anti-tank guns in Britain back. And what they do here, they take the suspension from an earlier model tank, that the A-tank. They get initially a couple of bus engines. They design a turret that can only take a 2-man crew with a 2-pounder gun, and they show it to the War Office. Some say it was on February the 14th, Valentine's Day. Other days, people have pointed out that's complete rubbish. It may have been a code word for the Vickers company, but they call it the Valentine tank because the war is for the Bishop, the self-propelled artillery at the time. But it's being followed there by a beautifully restored Cromwell. That was the tank that really took over from it. We don't actually use the Cromwell in combat till D-Day onwards. And again, this idea of top trumps, everyone says, oh well.
Okay, Cromwell versus Centaur in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
So as I mentioned, this is not just about engine power, it's also about the skill of the driver getting through the gears. I don't know if you can tell there, the one without the camouflage net is the Cromwell, the one with the camouflage net is the Centaur, and I can't see through the dust, which is the one that seems to be winning at the moment. It may well be that with that Liberty engine, which is the case, as you can see there, so driving past now. You can also see on the back there, some of the steam coming out the rear end is overheating the engine a little bit there on the Liberty, which is always one of the risks there as you're doing something like that. But there coming up behind is a Cromwell, which you would have put money on to have won. There you go, you're not going to see that anywhere else. And there we've got the M30, a recovery variant of the Grant tank with a dummy gun on. What else have we got racing across there? Actually, probably it's an awful lot lighter, which is why it's winning. We've got that M36 Jackson. We've got an M32 recovery tank based on the Sherman tank behind, seeing how quick they can whip across the arena here. And we'll see them come past us in the moment. You'll be able to see the differences between them all. This particular M36 Jackson got a different engine in the back as well. These went on service and that was put in by the Bosnian military. Now there you are, victorious Grant tank, recovery tank there. The idea I mentioned earlier, instead of getting rid of your tanks, put a dummy gun in the front and use it for towing other tanks out of trouble. That was called the M31 recovery variant there. There goes the Jackson there, the tank destroyer. You can see the guys in the top there. They haven't got turret rings, they've got an open turret. And the last of the vehicles on the top, got a jib to help lift engines, and it's got a winch in there as well, so it can help recover engines, or recover downed or broken down tanks, and pull them in, and tow bars and tow ropes to recover vehicles. We've also got our Sherman Jumbo again, giving a couple of laps. I was talking about that there. Much thicker armour, not many of them made, but they were used to lead attacks from September of 1944 onwards. And in consequence, because they got that thicker armour on, they were quite often put at the point tank. Not many of them survived the war because of that. So this particular relieved the American forces in Bastogne. The real tank that did that still survives in America in one of the American military museums. The idea being that, of course, famously the surrounded forces in Bastogne, you know, when they were relieved, this idea that somehow the Patton's Third Army and the tank force there came to their rescue. As the Americans said at the time, no one had told them that they needed rescuing. But this was one of the wars coming to an end, so they really they didn't want to lose crew members, and it's one of the first ones that bumped into the American 82nd Airborne Division troops. Now another one of these track vehicles going around, this is what they call a high-speed tractor. Not because it goes particularly fast. So, ladies and gentlemen, just to let you know what's going on, yes, there's a final bit of preparation. You're supposed to slide down.
So where that hole is, where that gap is, in the turret basket.
It can't continue. An example of this in the valiant defence of Ukraine by the Ukrainians in 22, in the spring of 22, as the Russians advanced Belarus south towards Kyiv, the Battle of the Irpin River, the Ukrainians were able to destroy the Russian armoured engineer vehicle. Some combat engineer tractor, also known as the Frog, was in its last really operational use, was to breach into the Basra police headquarters to rescue some British soldiers. And true to style, that Frog broke down, and a Challenger 2 gun tank had to go turret rear and batter down that raw wall with its toe plate. You can see the two vehicles moving around now, fairly interesting vehicles. To view now, we have Echo 21 Delta, so an AVLAB, a Chieftain AVLAB, and on the top of that you have a number 12 bridge. There's a 14 metre MLC 70 bridge, so that means it can cross gaps at about 13 metres wide, and it's strong enough to support a Chieftain or all the way up to Challenger 2. It's getting a bit, which is quite a heavy tank and needs a different bridge to support it. So the AVLAB has been moved in and it's moved up to the gap. The engineer reconnaissance has gone in and marked out that gap with those orange mine marking poles. The AVLAB is now deploying the bridge as good as he can, but you can see it's quite slow to get that bridge there. When you are deploying these bridges, you need to be as quick as you possibly can and really get in and out, get that bridge down, get across it, and get out at that point of peak danger as soon as possible. You see the AVLAB pushing that bridge up and moving it in there. These vehicles are really high valuable targets on the battlefield, and if this was real, everyone would be looking for that bridge launcher right now, and everyone would be looking to destroy it. So that crew, the crews in the Armoured Engineer Regiment used to say that during the Cold War, if the Cold War had gone hot, the AVLAB and AVRI would expect to last about 35 minutes. So a pretty dangerous type of activity. The AVRI, you can see moving plough down and go into the minefield. The plough goes underneath the landmines, and the idea is that the landmines are lifted off and out of the way, so they're not set off and you get a clear route. Evidently you're going to be driving into a lot of booby traps in that minefield, so there would be a lot of mines getting detonated on there. So again, a really dangerous task performed by the Corps. The kind of one of the ad hoc mottos of the Corps is follow the sapper. And you can see that kind of lived and brought out here, that the sappers at the front, at the vanguard of the battle, laying bridges, breaching minefields and assuring that the attack can be pressed home and the enemy can be... The display here is really unique. It's a really special display. I don't think an AVRI and AVLAB will have been operated alongside CETs for the last 20 to 30 years. So really special and really unique to see these vehicles being used in this way. And a real tribute to Joe Hughes, Jack and the rest of the gang who are able to operate these vehicles. They are very, very complicated. The armoured engineer vehicle, essentially you take the complexity of a bit of plant or brain and you combine it with a complexity of an armoured fighting vehicle, and really you get something that is more complex than the sum of its parts there. So it's a difficult thing to do and a difficult thing to keep on the road. So highly trained crews in service would be operating these, and here we have the guys as kind of professional. You may not be able to see it here. There is a gap in between the orange mine marking poles. Those in the VIP stands can look down and see there, and that gap has been dug out and it's about the height of a person, so a person can walk underneath that bridge there and what it's getting laid across. At one point the hydraulic rams on the AVLAB were the biggest hydraulic rams to feature on an armoured vehicle, and that hydraulic system there is a real monstrous hydraulic system, so an absolute work of art and engineering to get that all working together and put across. The Americans on this system, on the Chieftain AVLAB, the Americans operated that system off the M48, then M60, since replacing service by the Joint Assault Bridge, the JAB. Also Korea still operates the K1 AVLAB, and again that's using the Vickers system that you can see there, that system designed by Vickers up in Newcastle for this Titan in the service there, and that can lay a bridge in 90 seconds, so a bit of a step up in capability. You've got the toes of the bridge just touching down on the home bank there, and that's the bridge put in. And what you'll see now is the AVLAB, so Jack's just gone forwards onto that bridge to help the crew and guide that system out of there to get the system deconnected from the bridge. A really difficult one to do. Behind Behind the AVLab on the right hand side, you'll see the Avery with its pipe facade. You've got two gaps here, anti-tank trenches, or a river that's got an anti-tank trench on the enemy side to make a complicated obstacle. It's hard to get through, and then requires two armoured engineer assets to get through in there. So the AVLab is disconnected from the bridge and it's moving back now. Look to establish an intimate support on the enemy's bank, or the far bank, to then protect the Avery as it comes across. Traditionally you would be battened down going across the bridging, but a lot of these vehicles, the sites are not what they used to be. It came into the forefront in 1918 when the Allies were able to break through the Hindenburg line using combined arms, and it has evolved since then. And armies that can do this are the best armies in the world, and it's a very good metric of whether they are decent, solid armies that are able to fight a combined arms battle. Well, the Avery coming forwards now, an Avery representative of those used in the Falklands conflict, but this was used by the armoured engineers, this vehicle, from about the late 70s through to 2008. Initially, the armoured engineers after the Cold War, when they went into that period, relied on Churchill, and Churchill was used up until 1968. It was then replaced wholly by the Centurion Avery, and you'll have seen that trying to crush that Robin Reliant. So fairly quick, like jogging pace for an Avery. You would fire those bolts, and then that Fascine would roll off the top of the Avery into the gap, and then fill that gap there. You can see it's gone in and slidden off the top hamper, and then those pipes go into there and adapt to the kind of the gap or the hole there to fill it. So a really good capability. So we've got a gun tank now coming in as the full breakout force. That's going to cross that number 12 bridge there, up and over. Again, people having to be head out here. The sighting systems on these vehicles aren't what they were, and it does require these guys to be out to command the vehicles across that bridge. Going there across the Fascine, and what you'll see is that Fascine pressed down into the hole and adapting to the hole there. The vehicle is now across on the enemy bank, and it's going to push out as hard and fast and aggressive as it can to get out of the battlefield position. If we had them represented here, we'd have the IFB Warrior as the current in-service IFB going out next year, out of service next year. But that would be supporting their Warrior when it came into service alongside Chieftain, supporting those vehicles there. And don't worry, that smoke coming off the back of the Chieftain is a bit of a pyrotechnic, bit of a damp squib there, but
had a variant for carrying soldiers, part of the CVRT family. We had ambulance ones, Samaritan, built on that same chassis that the Scorpion tank was on. We've got the American M113. Looks very similar to the British 432. This is one of those vehicles, if you watch your Vietnam War movies, used out in the Vietnam era, that's where it got most publicity. It was made originally by the FMC company, Food Manufacturing Corporation of America, and they estimate this is one of the most numerous. The M113 is in front of you on the mound at the moment. That's been brought over again by the Belgians. Same engine and running gear is now on the next vehicle driving past the arena. That's a Lance missile carrier, normally inside, but it looked like it's just a steel bathtub on the top. And inside that bathtub would normally be carried a Lance missile. Basically, it was a short range but pretty hefty missile system that was in service. Britain used them as well. Lots of other countries ended up using, as I say, the variants of the M113. Some were load carriers. Other things they did with the M113, use the same engine, but we get the Abbott self-propelled gun. Now that's a 105mm gun on that Abbott chassis, or on the same, pretty much the same chassis as a 432. That was to replace the enemy. do as well. We have a Fox armoured car here today. The Fox, for various reasons, was not particularly liked in service. It gained a reputation as rolling over, so they were retired fairly early, but they took the turrets off to reuse them. Some of those turrets went on the 432, so we saw that 432/30. Some of them were put on other CVRT hulls, and that made something called the Sabre. Looks very similar to the Scimitar, but just slightly different boxes here and there. And as I mentioned, there was other versions of the CVRT. We ended up with Sultan, Striker, Spartan. I think we've still got Striker in service at the moment, carrying Starstreak missiles. CVRT retired from service. They were re-engined. They had that original Jaguar petrol engine. They were given a diesel engine after a while. A lot of them have been passed on now and are actually seeing service out in the Ukraine at the moment. So as I mentioned earlier, there's another whole story that's going to emerge in the future of how CVRT had a battle history. Abbott, it could swim. They made it amphibious, so it had a flotation screen around it. If you wanted to cross rivers, etc. We've seen about gap crossing. You can either lay a bridge or you can make... And in British Army service, it never had to fire its gun in anger. A bit like the Chieftain tank. Did its job in the Cold War, was there ready if needed, but luckily the Cold War never became a hot war. British Army of the Rhine sitting there keeping an eye on the border. At no point did the Soviet Warsaw Pact forces feel it was safe, or they were confident enough to be able to attack. Response 1956, Hungarian uprising. The Hungarians drove a T-55 tank into the British Embassy compound in Hungary, and we were able to measure the armour thickness on the front of the T-55 tank. And that frightened Britain, because basically at the time our Centurions had something called the 20-pounder gun on them, and we thought our 20-pounder wouldn't be able to penetrate its likely enemy. That was going to be the T-55 tank. So at Fort Halstead in Kent, they start a programme. Again, now they've managed to make smoothbore rounds. It's basically like almost like a polished tube drain pipe that they fire down. Also, it means that you can fire missiles from smoothbore. So again, the Soviets were very keen at one point to not just fire metal darts or shells out the end of their barrels, but also fire missiles which would go that much further and therefore attack enemy tanks at a greater distance. The PZ-68 driving past, there was questions in the Swiss Parliament about it because they had a number of faults they had to rectify, and one was a pretty dangerous fault. They found that you could load etc. And this is back in the Cold War, where we knew the Soviets had got, you know, big air force that was going to try and take all of our tanks before we've even got a chance of using them. So there's two Oerlikon cannons you can see as they go past. They're what they call 35mm Oerlikon cannons, and they can put a huge amount of ammunition up into the sky very, very quickly, which means that you've got a much better chance of World War II, and they helped set up the new modern Bundeswehr, which was the West German Army. And the German designers, and amazingly that included, for the Leopard 1, that included Ferdinand Porsche of German tanks in World War II. They all helped put the Leopard together, and the Leopard itself ends up going in a very different direction than that later war heavy German army. Had used the British Centurion tank when they were coming to the end of their service life in the 1970s. Those countries ended up moving on to Leopard rather than a British replacement. So Canada, Netherlands, lots of other countries, Belgium ended up buying the Leopard 1, and that's why you'll see lots of different variations between each country quite often had a slightly different criteria, different sometimes sighting systems, different levels of armour protection. So you can see on this Leopard as it goes through the area here, goes up the mount, it's got extra armour bolted on the side of the turret, and you can see the bolt holes where more armour protection would have been put, spaced armour at the end of that turret. Ultimately, the Leopard tank story is interesting because they were very clever, the Germans. They kept on building on the Leopard 1, then they moved on to the Leopard 2, and they were able to add protection, but they were very good in being able to keep the mobility of the tank up. So it's still one of the fastest tanks going. It can go tremendously fast backwards as well as forwards, and again, that speed on the battlefield, not just for shock action, but it means again, the faster you are, the harder you are to try and hit and take down. Now those of you can see the Gepard, it's showing its air defence system there, radar's turning, and again it can engage a target, or rather it's stuck for the Dutch army, and they've ended up calling it the Pruttel ever since. So the Leopard 1 tank story, as I mentioned, they were also in service with Canada, and it's an interesting one as well because a number of countries, the Netherlands had Leopard 1s and then Leopard 2s, Canada had Leopard 1s. They thought the age of the tank had really come to an end in the early 2000s, so they disposed of their Leopard 1 tanks. About the same time the Dutch army thought the same thing. And then the fighting kicked off in Afghanistan and Iraq, and so we ended up with the Americans having to rebuild a lot of their tanks, and they also realised that some of them weren't really up to it. So their earlier M47 tanks, they were in service a very short space of time, and then they handed them on to other countries whilst they developed what they thought was going to be a better tank of their own. Now we've got driving around at the moment, there's an M60 over, obviously no good at all to anyone. So the M60 has got a V-shaped or boat-shaped hull so that the blast will be vented up the sides of the vehicle, and you might lose a couple of road wheels, but the crew is still safe inside. I keep coming back to that L7 British gun. That's the gun they again put on. Now, as you can see, we've got some Soviet vehicles driving about as well. This is a vehicle with a missile carriage based on something called an MTLB. Again, the Soviets were very sensible when they were putting vehicle fleets together. They might be crude, but they realised it's so much easier if we've got the same engines, the same track systems, for again a family of vehicles, so all the crews, spare parts, it's commonality of parts, and the MTLB.
Okay, M60 and 2 Leopard, drive 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Oh, America's being left behind. America's being left in the dust. Literally the dust.
Straight something going away. Yeah. It's not. No, the one is like the one. Yeah, the next one. Not one that's bad, because that's like. The American one's. Oh, look at that one. That's going really fast, and it's like. In the lead though. In the lead.
I'll get ready for it.
So I think we all have to agree that was a pretty clear win for one of the Leopards there, although I expect we'll have a phone call soon from someone saying actually the Americans did really win. So again, tanks, that idea, what's behind this, yes, it's a great opportunity, but speed again, as I mentioned earlier, speed.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go!
Well, there's a turn up for the books. There's a Centurion beating a Chieftain there, which is quite something. Centurion, like I said, got that meteor in the back. You can see the dozer blade on the front there. It was used for clearing, making scrapes for hiding tanks in, clearing obstacles. We've got the Centurion gun tank there going past as well. And in last place, the Chieftain. We've also got another version of the Centurion there. We've got the ARV, Armoured Recovery Vehicle. They took some of the earlier Centurion gun tanks and took the turrets off, built a structure on the top with a winch in, separate dolly engine, to be able to recover broken down tanks on the battlefield. Originally we were using that were based on Second World War vehicles for recovery. Obviously when tanks are getting heavier, like the Centurion, you're sitting, almost laying backwards with the controls in front of him, and he has got a headrest. And as he drives along, in front of him obviously he's got his brake, his gear pedal and his accelerator pedal. Up in the turret behind him, you've got 3 crew members in that little space there. You've got a commander, and they're obviously in charge. They're looking out all the time. They're telling the driver the landscape ahead, because of course the driver being low down, he can't see as far as the commander can see. So that commander is scanning the landscape, not only just for the enemy if he's in combat, but he's looking at things. Are those tall bits of grass an indication of marshy ground? What's the best way to advance to keep yourself out of sight of the enemy, because they're going to hear you coming, but don't expose yourself to the last moment. And in the turret, the other side of the turret from the commander is the loader, and he's the guy, he doesn't have his own hatch, he's there actually to load the rounds in the gun, followed by a bag of explosive that blasts them out. Now just in front of that commander is seated the gunner. And the gunner's the one that's got the real issue, because they're trying to train that 120mm gun on a target, keep it on the target as the vehicle's driving around. And again, once they are on the target, it's quite often pointed out by the commander during the Cold War, completely surrounded all around Berlin by the Russians. In the British sector we had an armoured unit there. He realised there they all were painting their tanks green in an urban setting. It just didn't seem to work. So he came up with this scheme that he got 50 guineas for. He was given a reward for it. It's called the Berlin Camo Scheme, and what it does is it breaks up the outline of the vehicle. Doesn't look that effective against the greenery in the background we've got here, but if you look at this in an urban setting, you'll probably have an idea there's a vehicle there, but you don't know where it begins and ends. And it's a bit the same principle as dazzle ships in World War I. It breaks up an outline and you're not too sure if it's going one way or the other. Where does it start? Where does it end? And it's actually a very effective camouflage scheme. We're still using it, even though they've come up with a digital camouflage. And the Digicam looks great, costs too much money to apply all the time. The good thing about Berlin Camo, most of the guys with a couple of stencils could do it themselves. The second Chieftain going past, it might chill the barrel, so it might bend it. So you need to know all that, because it's such a long gun barrel, firing at a target that might be 3 kilometres away.
you don't want any slightest millimetre bend in that barrel before you fire, because if you do...
Because I know I know better than second nature. Yeah.